Now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for global insights and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thank you, Morgan. It's time for Global Insight, where we connect to experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Now, South Korean President Moon Jae-in is, of course, taking part in a virtual summit with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations this week. And under the theme, We Care, We Prepare and We Prosper, the 10-member regional bloc is to discuss fighting the COVID-19 pandemic and promoting economic recovery. But there's a great amount of attention on whether ASEAN countries will address the geopolitical challenges that have been mounting in recent months. And of course, these include the democratic crisis in Myanmar and tensions in the South China Sea, as well as the United States and China's rivalry in the region. We address these questions over ASEAN's capacity to unite and respond to the changing dynamics of the region. And for this, we are joined by Erwin Tan, Associate Professor at Hamburg University of Foreign Studies. Very warm welcome to you. And well, to kick things off, the annual summit began with drama, really, as Myanmar's representative didn't show up in protest over the regional bloc's exclusion of the country's top military general. And of course, to add some context there, Myanmar has been under the rule of a junta which staged a coup in February this year, overthrowing the Aung San Suu Kyi's democratically elected government. Well, are you expecting any extensive discussions or concrete actions to come out of the summit regarding Myanmar?
Hello, good morning, and my thanks for this invitation to participate in the discussion. Now, I anticipate that there would be some fairly comprehensive attempts to broker a diplomatic deal at this summit. I think it should be noted that for the first time, we're talking about ASEAN actually banning the Myanmar government from actually attending the summit, which is a step they haven't taken before. And the fact that you've got Biden condemning the government in Myanmar over its suppression of the pro-democracy movement. So that's essentially creating a lot of pressure to adopt a tough diplomatic statement on Myanmar. But that's only insofar as attempts to broker a diplomatic deal are concerned. The shortfall will be in the area of concrete action. ASEAN countries have long feared the prospect of foreign meddling in their internal affairs. Also, if the US is seen as acting too strongly against the Tatmadaw regime, they might actually run the risk of convincing wavering ASEAN countries to distance themselves from the US.
And while the democratic crisis in Myanmar, it's been considered something of a litmus test for ASEAN's effectiveness and its claim of being a rules-based and people-centered regional organization. And many think that it hasn't been doing enough and that its policy of non-intervention is rather irresponsible. What's your opinion on this?
Well, from one perspective, it's particularly my own as an ASEAN, as a citizen of an ASEAN country, I do agree that the current ASEAN way is irresponsible, in the sense that it basically marks the legacy of its old 1960s mindset. But if you then think in terms of another perspective, namely the contextual backdrop that saw the founding of ASEAN in the 1960s in the first place. Well, bear in mind that during the 1960s, you had fears of regional conflict within newly independent countries in Southeast Asia, and the Vietnam War was in full swing. So in that sense, compared to that backdrop, you can see it might be possible to argue that ASEAN is actually a bit of a qualified success as far as mitigating full-scale conflict between its members are concerned. The main limitation, as you pointed out then, is in how ASEAN can remain relevant for the foreseeable future, because you're talking about attempting to address policy issues that go beyond traditional interstate rivalry. In other words, the need to move beyond the existing 1960s mindset is where ASEAN will face a lot of challenges.
Right, and in the face of these challenges, in addition to the question of relevance, there have also been questions over its ability to respond in a joint fashion. And we haven't seen a joint Southeast Asian response to the Australia-UK-US pact, which aims to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. And of course, their reactions have varied considerably. While Singapore and Vietnam seem to back the initiative, Malaysia and Indonesia, they've warned that the agreement might actually trigger an arms race and undermine regional stability. What's your opinion on this?
I think the claims of an arms race have been somewhat overblown. I mean, all of the countries that you mentioned in ASEAN and outside of ASEAN have their own submarine programs and other arms acquisitions programs. It's part of the routine process of military modernization that all countries do all the time. But again, that's being qualified. An arms race, including a nuclear one, is a possibility in the event that either Australia or Japan go beyond just new submarines and end up developing nuclear warheads. Because if that happens, then, well, that's the kind of situation that might happen in the event that either country has reason to doubt the credibility of their nuclear-armed patrons.
And would you say that initiatives like Quad, which not only focuses on well, it's an informal alliance, of course, but it focuses on infrastructure, economic cooperation, vaccine production, all sorts of non-traditional security areas, and then there's also AUKUS. Does this really affect or does it undermine the centrality of ASEAN?
Well, I think the increased prominence of Quad does have the potential to undermine the centrality of ASEAN, because don't forget that none of the ASEAN members are represented in Quad, and only Vietnam is a Quad Plus member. So in that sense, yes, I think that's one area that ASEAN has to take into account. The fact that, adhering to its old 1960s mindset might run the risk of rendering itself irrelevant into the mid-21st century.
Well, it looks like President Biden might have some explaining to do to his Southeast Asian partners. And well, this was actually Biden's first meeting with Southeast Asian leaders as president. Would you say it's meaningful that he led the U.S. delegation to the ASEAN Virtual Summit compared to former leader Donald Trump, who skipped the summit in 2017?
Well, I think it indicates that the Biden administration recognizes that it has to shore up partnerships with ASEAN countries against China. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Part of this is the necessity of Biden having to salvage the U.S. soft power image since leaving the chaos of the Trump administration. Now, in this sense, the Biden administration has a number of things going for it. For instance, the success of the U.S.-made Pfizer vaccine can allow the Biden administration to salvage some level of U.S. soft power in the eyes of the international community. But elsewhere, and even before the Trump administration, I think it's interesting that several countries in Southeast Asia already had their own concerns about the implications of the rise of Chinese military power and have already been modernizing their military. Don't forget that Obama lifted the arms embargo on Vietnam. And the US, under Obama, Trump, and Biden, has also been stepping up the level of its own security cooperation with several countries in ASEAN, not just Vietnam, but also Singapore for decades, but also the Philippines and Indonesia, where in terms of joint security training exercises, new military establishments and facilities, and arms sales.
And how do you think the Biden administration is going to try and engage ASEAN countries amid Washington's rivalry with Beijing?
Well, and I think it's going to be a combination of hard and soft power. Soft power in terms of a promotion of the US-made Pfizer vaccine, which can allow the US to portray itself as a provider of public goods. Hard power in terms of, as I pointed out, the stepping up and increase joint military exercises with ASEAN countries, especially Singapore, which the US has an informal security relationship with, as well as further arms sales to help assuage regional fears of the implications of great power conflict.
And well, much like South Korea, for most Southeast Asian countries, their largest trading partner is China. So it's been very challenging for them to really respond to this intensifying rivalry between the two great economic powers. And well, how has China's rise and its assertiveness in the South China Sea and the Mekong River tested the solidarity of ASEAN countries?
Well, actually, it's already tested it even for decades earlier. Because one thing that China's been doing is to engage in economics-based influence operations, placing its increased amounts of infrastructure aid and investment in various developing countries in expectation for a regional quid pro quo being granted to Beijing's interest. So consider the fact that you've got Cambodia blocking ASEAN attempts to raise the station of the South China Sea, clear quid pro quo being offered to Beijing. But I think that was pretty much in the pre-2020 phase. Now, considering the extent to which the COVID-19 has put the spotlight on China's track record of global governance, especially the fact that the municipal authorities in Wuhan tried to cover up the pandemic in the first place, the fact that China's been supplying low-quality ventilators and masks to other countries, has also further dented China's soft power image. Now, I would say that some number of countries are clearly and firmly in the Chinese camp and will likely remain so for the foreseeable future. But other countries, the Quad members that I mentioned, several countries in ASEAN, especially Vietnam and Indonesia, are also moving away from China. Although the extent to which they are willing to sign up to a US-led containment of China is also up for question. In this sense, a lot will also depend on the specific nature of US attempts to contain China.
Well, ASEAN countries, well, they wanted to be at the center of all Southeast Asian affairs, of course, but until now as it is in the case of many so-called middle powers, we've seen a lot of feel-good statements, words like co-prosperity and cooperation. But can ASEAN actually go beyond issuing statements and simply reacting to regional dynamics to actually shaping them?
Well, I think ASEAN can attempt to shape some of these regional dynamics, but its ability to do so is itself dependent on cooperating with the great powers, because ASEAN members on their own, or even ASEAN as a collective, has limited diplomatic willpower and clout. Now, I think it might be helpful for a start, for ASEAN to move beyond its old 1960s mindset that was so obsessed with the prospect of foreign meddling in their internal affairs. So in this sense, addressing the situation in Myanmar would be a good start. I think efforts to address common issues, shared ASEAN issues such as these, seeking stability in the South China Sea is also a worthy area, even as certain members of ASEAN are balking at this. Now, I think a further area that ASEAN should also attempt to explore as a sort of a diplomatically low-cost move is to address issues of shared global concern, which do not involve any explicit political costs. So, for instance, things like the issues of plastic and garbage dumping at sea, or local initiatives to promote low carbon emissions energy sources, such as solar and wind power, are the kind of low-cost initiatives that can help ASEAN to consolidate its position.
And do you see any ways that perhaps South Korea could share in that, ways that South Korea and ASEAN countries could work together to increase multilateralism and promote global norms in the region?
Well, I think if we extend this from my earlier point about non-explicit forms of geostrategic rivalry as a low-cost means of addressing shared global issues. So in this sense, the ROK has a good start. It has a very largely positive image in many countries in ASEAN due to its pattern of rapid economic development during the 20th century, the kind of track record that many developing countries in Southeast Asia actually like to emulate. Moreover, I think the track record of three countries in particular, not just the ROK, but one ASEAN country, Singapore, and also Taiwan, are extremely interesting in addressing, and how they address the COVID-19 crisis, offer lessons that other countries around the world might attempt to emulate. Now, Moon Jae-in is expected to leave office shortly, so I think it's going to be up for the debate over the implication, the type of policy towards Southeast Asia that is practiced in the period up from 2022 onwards. But I think in the event that we can continue the existing principles of Moon Jae-in's New Southern policy, in the event that it takes a similar form under Moon's successor, it does offer the potential of a win-win solution. Because if you think in terms of providing the ROK with opportunities to promote aspects of its economic modernization model to developing countries in ASEAN. And so in this sense, I think it's quite notable that Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam are particularly valuable opportunities for South Korean economic investment, if you think in terms of low labor costs, as well as highly literate workforces.
And do you think, well, before he leaves office, President Moon Jae-in will be able to see some progress on his New Southern policy that you just mentioned?
Personally, I doubt so. The members of ASEAN are very diverse in terms of their levels of political and economic development. Not only that, if you also consider the extent of the disruption resulting from COVID-19, it's extremely severe disruption, so much so that it has essentially set back attempts to promote economic cooperation. Now, that being said, though, it's not a failure of the New Southern policy. I think it's more helpful to see the New Southern policy as a medium to long-term initiative that will take time to bear fruit.
And well, this is all we have time for today, but that was Erwin Tan, Associate Professor at Hanguk University of Foreign Studies. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Have a good day.